On June 14, 2026, British commandos boarded an oil tanker in the English Channel. The operation involved military and law enforcement personnel and lasted for 6 hours. And when it was over, the ship was no longer free to continue its journey. Its name was SMYRTOS. An oil tanker might not sound like the kind of vessel that would require this much attention, but the British government had a reason for stopping this particular ship. And that raises a much bigger question. Why did stopping one tanker require an operation involving commandos, helicopters, aircraft, and naval vessels? What was so important about this ship? And more importantly, what was it carrying? Look closely at the ship and you might think you know what you're looking at. There's a name painted across the hull, a flag flying from the stern, and a company listed as the owner. Simple, right? Except it's not. A ship can be registered in one country, owned by a company in another, managed somewhere else, and carrying cargo that belongs to someone else entirely. On paper, everything can look perfectly legitimate. And that's what makes the global shipping industry so difficult to understand. The further you follow the paperwork, the harder it becomes to find the person, or the company, actually behind the ship. Once you understand that, the story of one tanker starts to look very different. Because the question isn't just where the ship is, it's who really owns it. The word owner sounds simple enough, but in international shipping, it can be surprisingly difficult to answer. The company listed on a ship's documents may not be the same company that actually operates it. The registered owner can be based in one country, while the ship is managed from another, and the people making decisions about its cargo may be somewhere else entirely. That doesn't automatically mean anything illegal is happening. This is simply how much of the shipping industry is structured. Ships operate across borders, and companies use different jurisdictions for everything from registration to management and insurance. But it does create a problem. When governments want to know who is behind a vessel, they can't always just look at the name painted on its hull. They have to follow a trail of companies, registries, documents, and legal identities that can stretch across multiple countries. And sometimes, by the time you reach the end of that trail, you discover something unexpected. The country a ship is registered in may have very little to do with the people who actually control it. And that brings us to one of the most important ideas in global shipping. The flag. Every ship needs a flag. Not just as a symbol, but as a legal identity. The flag tells the world which country has registered the vessel and, in many cases, which country's laws and regulations apply to it at sea. But here's the part that most people never think about. The flag doesn't necessarily tell you where the ship was built, where its owners live, or even where the company running it is based. A vessel built in South Korea can be owned through a company in Greece, managed from Singapore, insured somewhere else, and registered under the flag of Panama. And this isn't unusual. In fact, it's one of the foundations of modern global shipping. For ship owners, choosing where to register a vessel can affect everything from taxes and operating costs to the regulations the ship has to follow. Countries that offer these registrations are often called open registries, and the practice is commonly known as a flag of convenience. On paper, it's a perfectly legal system, but it creates something fascinating. A ship can travel across the world while its legal identity remains tied to a country it may never visit. And when you start asking why so many ship owners choose the same handful of countries to register their vessels, the story becomes much bigger than one tanker. Take Panama. It might seem like an unusual place to look for the center of the world's shipping industry, but Panama operates one of the largest ship registries on Earth, with thousands of vessels registered under its flag. And Panama isn't alone. Liberia and the Marshall Islands have also become major players in the global shipping industry, even though most of the ships registered there aren't carrying cargo between those countries. That's because the flag is often chosen for practical reasons. A shipowner might be looking for lower operating costs, a simpler registration process, or a legal framework that makes it easier to run a vessel across international waters. For the shipping industry, this can make global trade faster and cheaper. But it also creates a strange separation between the ship you see at sea and the system that controls it. The vessel might fly one country's flag, belong to a company registered in another, and be managed from somewhere else entirely. And when something goes wrong, that separation can make a very simple question surprisingly difficult to answer. Who is actually responsible? Because if you can separate the ship from its owner, and the owner from the company, and the company from the country, then finding the person behind the entire operation becomes a very different kind of investigation. For most of the shipping industry, this arrangement is simply business. Ships need to move, companies need to keep costs under control. Cargo needs to reach its destination, and the legal structures behind all of that have evolved to make global trade possible. But there's a consequence to having so many different companies, countries, and jurisdictions involved in a single voyage. Accountability can become complicated. If a ship is involved in an accident, investigators have to determine which laws apply and who is responsible. If a company breaks the rules, authorities may have to trace a chain of ownership that crosses several borders. And when the stakes become higher, that complexity matters even more. Because governments don't just need to know where a ship is. They need to know who controls it, who benefits from its cargo, and who is ultimately responsible for what happens at sea. That becomes especially important when a government tries to stop a particular shipment from reaching the market. Because you can place a company on a sanctions list. You can restrict a country's exports. You can even put a price on the cargo. But none of that matters very much. If the ship carrying it can keep moving. After Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, governments faced a difficult problem. They wanted to put pressure on Russia's economy without taking Russian oil completely off the global market. The reason was simple. The world still depended heavily on energy, and removing a major producer overnight could send prices soaring everywhere. So the strategy became more complicated. The European Union and its allies introduced sanctions, restrictions on Russian oil, and a price cap designed to limit how much revenue Russia could earn from its exports while allowing some of that oil to continue reaching international markets. On paper, it was a compromise. Russia could still sell its oil. The world could still buy it. But the amount of money flowing back to Russia was supposed to be reduced. And that created a new problem. The restrictions didn't just change where the oil could go, they changed the economics of moving it. Insurance became more complicated, shipping routes changed, buyers and sellers had to find new ways to do business. And suddenly, the question wasn't simply whether Russian oil could be sold. It was how far the existing shipping system could be stretched to keep it moving. Because the moment you put a limit on something worth billions of dollars, someone will start looking for a way around it. And gradually, a different kind of fleet began to emerge. Not a fleet owned by one company, not a fleet controlled by one government. There was no single headquarters, no official organization, and no list of ships that everyone could simply point to. Instead, it was a loose network of vessels operating through a maze of different owners, companies, flags, and jurisdictions. Some of these ships were old, some changed ownership, some changed their registration. Others moved through complicated corporate structures that made it difficult to see who was actually behind them. And together, they became known as the Shadow Fleet. The name sounds dramatic, but the idea behind it is surprisingly simple. These were ships that could keep moving cargo even when the normal routes of international trade became harder to use. And that made them incredibly valuable. Because if a tanker could operate outside the traditional shipping networks, it could potentially connect buyers and sellers who were no longer supposed to do business in the usual way. The cargo could still move. The money could still move. And somewhere in between, the trail could become much harder to follow. That was the real power of the system. Not making a ship invisible, but making it much harder to see who was behind it. So why did Britain stop SMYRTOS? Because by the time the tanker entered the English Channel, it had become part of a much larger geopolitical struggle over how Russian oil could continue reaching the global market. The vessel had been sanctioned by the United Kingdom, and British authorities said it had entered UK territorial waters without a legitimate flag. That gave the government a legal basis to intervene, and for the first time, British forces carried out an operation to board a vessel associated with the Russian Shadow Fleet. But the significance of SMYRTOS wasn't simply that one tanker had been stopped. It was that the rules surrounding global trade were being tested in real time. For decades, the shipping industry had built an incredibly efficient system for moving goods across borders. Ships could change flags, companies could operate across jurisdictions, and cargo could travel through a network of ports and markets that connected almost every part of the world. Now that same infrastructure was being tested by governments trying to restrict where certain cargo could go, and by networks determined to keep it moving. And that's why the story matters. Because the future of sanctions may not be decided in a courtroom or at a border crossing. It may be decided somewhere out at sea, by who can keep a ship moving.